Hey guys, welcome to the Wednesday wrap up with Z-Man. Welcome, Z-Man. It's good to have you here.
I'm doing well. I'm sorry, I'm boomer teching here. I'm actually I try to watch the chats while we're doing this, but there's different places here to look. So anyway, yeah, I'm doing well. It's miserable here. It's been pouring rain for the last 48 hours. It's supposed to finally stop tomorrow afternoon. So, but I mean, it's been cold though. That's kind of weird.
Yeah, we got, as I was telling you before the show, we had bad thunderstorms yesterday or a night ago. Just took out power for 5 hours at my house. Like 35,000 homes were without power, so it was pretty bad. But yeah, that's May in the mountains here, so it's good to be here. And Z-Man, before I start out the show, guys, thank you so much for watching this. And our format, if you're new to this, we typically go an hour and we will read your super chats and rants and power chats at the end, but get them in early. I promise we'll get to them. And that's the way to show that you really do appreciate the show. It means a lot to us. And Z-Man and I, just so you know, every month I split all the super chats with them. So we divide it equally. And YouTube has super chats, Rumble has rants, power chats. You see the link below. That works well. And then Streamelements has a tip feature. And again, send them in early. We will get to them and we'll discuss it. And I appreciate that. We do this every Wednesday evening. And if you have ideas for shows, let us know. We typically deep dive into a topic, which is kind of interesting. On my daily show, I usually do the news of the day, but it's kind of good to get into a specific topic. And Z-Man suggested this one. And Z-Man, I saw you wrote about this today too, your generational politics.
Yeah, I tell you, I don't, I've said this before. I said it many times actually. I hate generational politics because it attracts two kinds of people that I dislike the most. One are retards, and they turn up boomer. You call everybody who's
Right.
older than 30 a boomer, it's just stupid. And but the other person it attracts typically is the pendant, the person that says, if you call Donald Trump a boomer, well, he was born 3 days earlier than this. It's like, God, they make me crazy with that stuff. But
Yeah.
But the other thing is too is that generational politics is always aimed at white people, and you're supposed to hate your children or hate your ancestors. I mean, it's just really, I think, kind of pointless. But that said, there is things to say about it. And last weekend, I was in Tennessee for the Old Glory Club national meeting, which that was a very, very nice event. Probably one of the best events I've ever been to be honest. And I didn't know, I had no expectations of it. And it turned out it's all millennials. Well, not all millennials. It was millennials were the big middle part of the bell curve. The one tail would be some Xers and then some Zoomers on the other side. And so it was a really interesting thing because it's a social club. It's not really political. Is to see men 33 to 43, 5, something like that. I'm guessing because I'm trying to think of some of the age people told me and how they interact. And they talked about themselves a lot. I mean, they talked about millennials and millennial issues and all the other stuff. It was like, it was kind of like being, having, you ever had that experience where you're in one room and a bunch of women are in the other room talking and you're like, holy smokes, wait a second, what the hell are they talking about? You're kind of surprised, you find out they cuss like pirates, but it's kind of that same thing. I just didn't think too much about it. And so I took a bunch of notes about millennials and what they're thinking about and stuff. And it occurred to me, they're going to be taken over here soon. Soon, like in the next few years, JD Vance could be the next president, and he's quintessential millennial. So, knowing what these people are about, what this generation is about, is I think worthwhile. I mean, I think hopefully they're really into paying their taxes, so my Social Security keeps coming.
Yeah, I agree. I just want to echo some of your points, and I'm going to steal this quote from Jim Goat. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he wrote that about this generational astrology. That's what he calls this, is roughly about 240 times dumber than regular astrology because it attempts to argue that everyone born during the same 20-year period will share the same character traits. And I always thought that was funny. And there is a lot of truth to that. Obviously, this is just a generalization. However, I do think when you're born and the time you're born influences you. And this went back, I saw with my grandparents. I'm old, but my grandparents are all dead now. But they were raised, well, they were actually young adults during the Depression. And that really influenced their whole lives. Like they would never invest in stocks. They just bought safe CDs, very conservative. They always held on to anything because you never knew, what would happen. And so the times you're born in really do influence, I think, the way you look. So I think there is something to generational politics. That boomers see things different, let's say, than Gen X or millennials. But there's always a caveat. Obviously, this is a generalization. And as you said, when you get on the edges, it gets even more confusing because obviously I have more in common with you, even though we're technically, I guess, different generations, but it's just ridiculous than I would with someone born in 1945. And we'll talk about that a little bit. Another thing you said is I think other cultures have it to a degree because I did some research, and in China, the young people look back at the old people a little bit differently, how they were raised under communism. So there is a little bit of that, and they've even picked up the boomer thing and they've translated it to their language. Okay, boomer. It's kind of funny how that is. But this isn't nothing. This isn't really anything new. In ancient times, Plato wrote about the youth disrespecting the older elders, and Socrates, he's corrupting the Athenian youth with these new ideas. And this was 400 BC. So I think this is somewhat timeless. But I think in the age of social media and everything, I think it's just been accelerated. So I think this should be interesting discussing this. And one of the things I'll lead off with, because I always call myself on the edge of boom or Gen X because I don't really care. People call me whatever. But I was too young to be drafted in the Vietnam War. I was just a little kid. I had nothing about the hippie era. That was before me in the summer of love. By the time I got in university, it was Ronald Reagan was president. We were in the 80s, punk rock, MTV. So it was an entirely different generation there. But I can remember the generation right before me. And it is sort of fascinating, the boomers, because I remember very distinctly, they had, don't trust anyone over 30, man. And old people just don't understand. And they had that term, it showed up in Time magazine in 1967, the generation gap between, this new generation versus the old squares, I guess they would call them. So it is kind of interesting now that the boomers, who always prided themselves of being young, that was their defining characteristic. We're young and hip. And now you're like, no, now you're old and cringe. People like Hillary Clinton and so forth. It's got to be hard for them.
Yeah, instead of young and hip, it's old with a broken hip. That's but what? But there's a cultural aspect to it. I think that's really what matters. If you were born in, say, 1946, well, you really didn't experience the radical late 60s, early 70s stuff with growing your hair long and all that stuff. You were more like the Beatles than the Stones, you know what I mean? As that gap there. But if you were born in 1956, well, then you did, So there's really two waves of boomers in a lot of ways. But, I think one of the strange things about being in our generation, though, is that I think, I've talked to, I've had this conversation with lots of my peers in our age group, people at different events and stuff like that. And always, it's the same way. It's like, we grew up constantly hearing about the boomers and about, that generational stuff. And it makes your eyes roll, you just glaze over. You don't want to hear about it anymore. I used to joke that I learned more about Vietnam in high school than I did about the American Civil War, and it was just, because you just got pounded over the head with it. So I think our generation, having grown up in the shadow of the boomers, were affected by it in a weird way. Our sort of Gen X culture is affected by having grown up in the shadow of this giant blob of people who, let's face it. I mean, there was never a time in my work that I ever imagined that, I always knew that by the time I got to the point where you would take up a senior position in a corporation, I would be too old because the boomers would stick around forever. That was just the way it is. And I think it had a big impact on Gen Xers' work attitudes. Hey, if you can never get over that hump, you're always going to be blocked by these people. Well, then you have to have a different view of life and work and all that. I mean, I remember hearing people getting mad at our generation for job hopping. We were the real first job hoppers, to say,
Right.
No loyalty to the company and all that. So, I mean, I don't want to dismiss it. And when I'm sitting there watching these guys, these millennials, it occurred to me is that, they really did kind of grow up different than I did. Our generation was the last generation to grow up wild, where you had lots of unsupervised time. And these guys did not. They grew up with helicopter parents and, structured play and supervised activities after school. And I was kind of, I was talking to them about, these guys were in their 30s. Maybe one guy was in his early 40s. And I brought this up and they go, yeah, absolutely. They think about that. And then so the ones who are having kids now are saying, I want my kids to have time away from the adults. I want to figure out, we got to figure out how to make them grow up so they can have, unsupervised time on the playground and stuff. So, it really, there is these differences. And, I think with the millennials, they really are very attuned to living in and being in a system, and they expect the system to work as described on the box. They really do have this expectation that things are supposed to work. They're supposed to work this way, which is not a bad thing. I mean, it's, having that saying, hey, look, our government should actually do what it's supposed to do is not unreasonable. And, and it has to do with how they were raised. But at the same time, their parents are mostly boomers. So for them to rant against the boomers, it's like saying, because inevitably it's, well, my parents aren't really like that. I heard that a bunch of times. Well, my parents are boomers, but they're pretty cool boomers. We all do that stuff. We make the exceptions for the things that we know, that are rather than the generalization. But I think, I do think there is something to the generational politics and the attitudes that are formed. And look, every culture's different. Think about how, I think we talked about this once before. If you went to your high school in 1978 and looked at the yearbook and then looked in 1985, it's a completely different world. The people are dressed different. In 1978, the men had crazy haircuts and wore cranberry leisure suits to their prom. 5 years later, you're wearing regular tuxedos and you bathe regularly and all the other stuff. So, there is a big difference there. And, given that the millennials are really just about to take over, think about it. It's a pretty good chance that the 2028 presidential election will be between Ocasio-Cortez and J.D. Vance. That really would be the two main sides of the millennial generation.
So you're discounting Joe Biden making another run. He'll be rested and fit to go again.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that he's not going to outrun whatever the cancer he's got, ass cancer. So,
no, I agree with you. And there's a book. I don't know if you ever read it. It was called, I think, Generations. I have it here somewhere. It was written in the 90s. It was pretty mainstream. And the guy went through the historical generations, and this was up to the 90s. And he thought the cycles. And the boomers were a very idealistic generation, with all their ideas. And then the Gen X, he described whatever term he used for it. He didn't call it Gen X, but they were a very cynical generation. And our generation, right after the boomers, whatever you want to call it, they were very cynical. They just were about, let's just make money, let's be practical. And I remember when I went on university in the early 80s, we saw this because we had some old boomers that were still on campus. There's some that just never would leave, it seems like. And they were trying to start a rally against Reagan's involvement in Central America. We're going to have a big protest on the Student Square. And no one showed up because no one gives a damn. Everyone just wanted to drink and have fun. No one cared about politics. Everyone was tired of that bullshit, we thought. So we didn't care about that. And it seems like the millennials, they kind of took after the boomers again, because they were all about, that's where we got the woke and all the I've heard millennials say non-ironically, "Oh, trigger warning, we're talking about sexual assault in this story." Just stuff like this, it's like, my God. I said that stuff tongue in cheek, but I've seen them literally say this,
Yeah.
and it's just a real different. And then I think the Zoomers are a little bit more cynical than the millennials. So it's kind of interesting how that is playing out. And since this show, we deal a lot with politics. I guess the interesting discussion, and we could talk about the right and the left, of how do the boomers, do you say, on the what we call the right, let's say the Republicans, and I know that's a broad category, how do they differ from let's say the younger generation, Gen X and the millennials, and also the Democrat Party? Because I see in both the parties there's a real almost civil war. You talked about like JD Vance on the Republican side and AOC, and they're kind of against the establishment because the establishment of both the parties are either boomers or even older, silent generation.
Okay.
Like, wouldn't Biden be considered the silent generation?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I think, give or take, if you're born between, before the war ended, you really fall into that category. I mean, he was probably old enough to be drafted for Korea, I think. So yeah, I mean, I'm not 100% sure on that, but yeah, it really is kind of a weird thing in a way, because if you look, the younger people, the millennials that are on, say, the Democratic side, people we call the left in mainstream politics, they're crazy. I mean,
They are. Yeah.
They're, I mean, anti-white. They're almost chaotic evil. The old Dungeons and Dragons thing.
Yes.
There's lawful evil. Hillary Clinton was lawful evil. AOC is chaotic evil.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you get their fringy people, the people who are out all over on blue sky, I mean, they're certifiable. I mean, I'm not saying that as just to exaggerate. I mean, they are paranoid people who think that there's an invisible army of Hitlers out there lurking to get them and all that. I mean, they're completely bonkers, but they're highly female. They're very, very female. And this is something that the millennial guys told me over the weekend. A number of them brought this up, and they said, you know what? One of the things that we noticed is that in our generation, it's almost a male-female divide. In other words, politics is a war against the sexes. While in our parents' generation, you'd have mom and dad agree on everything, left or right. It'd be one side or the other. Somebody could have liberal parents, and they have, the guys we're talking about. They know guys who are in our kind of politics, and the wife is on blue sky. And they find some weird accommodation at home. And I think, that is a big difference there as far as the male female divide. And you see it again with Vance. Vance is a very normal sort of guy. I mean, he's just normal. I mean, that's the weird thing about Vance. Even, I guess, Rubio's really not a millennial, but I don't know where a millennial falls in. But these millennials you're seeing in the administration are all pretty normal. They're all intolerant of a lot of this stuff. I mean, JD Vance is very dismissive of the crazy talk. He just doesn't. I mean, and so it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. I mean, could you imagine a debate between Ocasio-Cortez where, she's vacillating between shaking her boobs and her increasingly wide ass to try and, use her female walls, but at the same time complaining about the patriarchy. And then there's Vance with that goofy look on his face, like, are you serious? You're making me stand here with this hysterical noob? I mean, and it could very well simply be that, in the long run, the girls will always follow the guys. My father always used to say that. Women always want to follow a man. Just always remember that. No matter what they say, what they do, eventually they'll wind up following you. And so maybe that's, we're going to get this harmonic conversion as the millennials all hit middle age, the women will fall in line. But I mean, if they're not married, well, odds are they'll just even get crazier. So, it's going to be in their old age, our television time will at least be entertaining.
Yeah, it definitely will. And I looked up, by the way, Biden was born in 42. So he was born
Jesus
during
Christ.
the war. So actually he is a silent generation because he wasn't yet born after the war.
He was still alive while Hitler was alive. He was born. He was alive when Hitler. I mean, that's a pretty small club of people who were alive when Hitler was alive.
Yes, I know. It's like it is amazing when you think about that. But I tell you, I talk about generations. I still remember my grandfather, and he remembers when he was a kid talking to old Civil War veterans. I mean, that really dates you. So, but I think this, you brought up a good point about the male-female dynamics. I want to kind of explore that between the generations. I would argue the baby boomers, they had a lot of issues, but they had parents in general, fathers and mothers. Divorce was pretty rare. But when you start to get to the Generation X, we were the first generation that divorce started to become common. Just as a disclaimer, my parents were divorced when I was kids. Sasha was born in 1979. Her parents were divorced. I believe you said you were through that situation. And JD Vance was in a similar situation. Luckily, I was raised with my dad, and so was Sasha, which I think fathers actually, if you have to pick a mother or father, I think fathers do better. But a lot of millennials have been raised by women, and I think that has feminized much of our discourse, and you really see that. Whereas the older people, they were raised by the father, where the father was a disciplinarian, and you better watch out, you better wait till your dad gets home, you're going to get a whooping. So I think there's been a big change just in that dynamic as when it comes to masculinity and male female dynamics.
Yeah, it gets to that unsupervised versus supervised childhood. Because I still remember this. I guess, I don't know, I was 10 or 11 years old, something like that. All of a sudden, instantly, everybody's family got a divorce. It was the craziest thing. It was like within 1 year, And instead of all of us coming home from school and having mothers there, or at least some worked or whatever, but, they would talk and make sure that, hey, they take their school clothes off before they went out and play, all that kind of stuff. All of a sudden, there's nobody around. Moms are working, dads are out gone, and a big chunk of those preteen years, I was unsupervised. It was like being raised by wolves. And I think to some degree, the reason why the millennials had so much structure is that the system started filling it in. The school started having all these after school programs and weekend programs, and of course, midnight basketball and, all these different things. And the pendulum went completely the opposite way with the helicopter parents and all the other business. And, there was I forget who it was, some woman, she got in trouble for letting her 10-year-old ride the subway, because kids used to ride the bus and subways all the time, in New York City and, big cities, they used to ride the subway to school. It's what they did. And then all of a sudden that all stopped and children got very protected. And, the millennials have that longhouse concept, where it's a female-dominated world, and the men are on the periphery. And I think you're absolutely right. It makes a big difference in how they interact with other men, because I do find it sometimes kind of weird in the workplace to deal with millennial males. They're almost, I don't want to use the word girlish, but there's a softness there. There's that, how women will do that passive-aggressive thing, where they kind of literally it means one thing, but it really means the opposite, and you all know what that is, and you get that from guys in the workplace. You're like, man, this is very weird, but it's because if you're raised by women and that's the only authority for most of your life, I guess it stands to reason. But I think they might actually grow out of it, though. I think JD Vance is a pretty good example of this. I think in a lot of ways, he kind of flowered as a man after the Marine Corps, after he got into the workplace. And I think maybe once he got married and realized, I can't be that kind of guy. I can't be that guy I was raised to be. I got to be something else. And so, knock on wood, as these guys hit their middle years, they start to, take up golf and shooting and, and that kind of stuff. They say, what I mean? They start looking around and say, how can I be a real man rather than this sort of softy, touchy-feely kind of guy?
Do you think that because of the generations are actually more, and I'm going to use the term loosely, I don't like the term, but extreme. And what I mean by that, it seems like the younger people on the right tend to be much more right-wing than the boomers. And I would say on the left, it's the same way. The younger people are a lot more extreme, if I can use that word, than their elders. It seemed like the old school Democrats were about unions, job safety, the environment, all the socialized medicine. And on the Republican side, it was about tax cuts, obviously supporting Israel, being a strong national defense. And now a lot of this is our politics I think, are going to go through drastic change. Speaking, always dread going on this topic because it gets everyone all excited, but Israel, I know. Why don't you name him Ramsey Ball and Z-Man? We always get those comments. So like they just want to say that word over and over. They'd be happy. That's all we need to do for a whole show. But the people on the right, they're not that very sympathetic towards Israel. Younger people. I mean, the older boomers, oh my God, they love Israel more than life itself. And on the left, you're starting to see, obviously, very sympathy towards the Palestinians in Gaza and all the protests at the universities against Israel. So do you see this almost like a split more in our country where when I was younger, maybe I was naive, but it seemed like Republicans and Democrats, they were kind of in the same ballpark now. But now it just seems there's a lot of division that's pretty strong. Do you see that a little bit with maybe that's part youth tends to be more extreme anyway, though, than older people? You lose some of the extreme things. Oh, I get more extreme, but that's typically how it happens. So how do you see that the generations impacting the Republicans and Democrat policies? Like, do the younger people really want communism, socialism, anti-whiteism, the whole child sex change? And does the right really want you saw these people, the Shiloh saying the gamer word, and people, I'm just hearing people like Matt Walsh, they're sounding more radical than me. So there's been a big change on the right with the younger people too. It's really interesting how that's been starting to divide.
Yeah, we had when we came along, there was the Cold War consensus. You couldn't have these big fights. I mean, really, if you think about it, everybody agreed on generally the cultural stuff. Because the cultural war had kind of settled down. So
yeah.
So it was really about economics. But I think with like millennials, and I definitely with the Zoomers. The Zoomers are really a strange case in a lot of ways because they are clearly far more right wing when they do polling on it. Now, measuring what right wing is always debatable, but I think observationally we can say they're not a lot of dewy-eyed idealists and thinking that we're all going to get along wonderful. But at the same time, you have that, then you have 14% report being something other than heteronormative.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's just it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But I think it's that splintering of the culture, and I think with the millennials, you're starting to see that as they hit middle age, they are kind of that they went from that sort of mushy middle, sort of feminine, accommodationalist politics to much more confrontational. But I think when I say confrontational, I think that's not the right word. I think it's, hey, we're going to find a way to carve out our own spaces so we do not have to deal with these bleeping people. I think that's kind of how it is. That's when the people at the Old Glory Club, that came through. They're like, hey, because they're basically rebuilding the old fraternities like moose clubs and stuff.
Right.
I mean, that's really what they're doing. And it's all guys, and they're generally, in that age range. And it's, hey, you know what? We're going to recreate our private spaces. We're going to recreate our civic society within this world. I mean, there's people in Tennessee now, in Kentucky, they're coming together to try and buy up rural real estate so they can actually build their own houses and be there. Not like a commune, but saying, hey, we're going to have a development with 10 lots. We want to have 10 people who are like us living.
Arkansas is doing that too. There's a big group down here doing that. Yeah.
Yeah, they're turning up. So that's 3. And there's probably, I think there's one in New Hampshire. So it might be 4. Yeah. I mean, at least, so it's stuff like that. So I think you're right in a way in that they were raised to be very conformist, and now they're not going crazy. They're just kind of going the other way. It's splitting up because, how do you have middle ground with someone? I mean, in a lot of ways, I kind of feel sorry for the younger generations. I mean, think about, just let's keep it real basic. Imagine you're in college and you see a girl, she's pretty, you talk to her, and then you got to think, does she have a penis? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or would she like one, but not mine? You know what I mean? It's just like, it just is so screwed up how, youth is. And it really did start with the millennials, and it's gotten increasingly weird. And so I can understand why they're becoming more extremist. Which I mean, I don't know if that's a really great word. I mean, you think about it. People who are always running around calling everyone extremist are 20% of the white population, which is means they're about what 10% of the overall 12% of the overall population. The other 88% thinks they're nuts, but the other 88% is the extremist. I mean, that's just
Yeah, I don't like that word either, but it's just there has been a shift on both parties. It's been interesting. The younger people are moving the Democrat Party in a very, I would say, extreme direction compared to how it used to be. When I was a kid, I'm so old, I remember in the South, people voted Democrat and they were very
Oh, yeah.
conservative. And it goes back to the Civil War, actually. They still hated Lincoln. That's all over. But so the old Democrats are gone, and I would argue the old Republicans of the Buckley era are almost gone. They're going extinct. You still
Yeah.
have Lindsey Graham and a few of those holdouts, but in general, they're becoming dinosaurs. So that's interesting. And do you think another aspect I see, and this is fascinating too, is because the boomer generation was the first generation, or one of the first, that was really themselves sort of pampered because it was just after World War II. There's a lot of hardship. Their parents typically went through the Depression, right? If you're a baby boomer, your parents probably went through the Depression. They had hard times. And it was always, I want my kids to do better than me. I'm going to invest in my children and everything. And so the boomers, the millennials see the boomers had everything on easy mode, meaning it was still a 90% white country. There wasn't DEI. You weren't discriminated because you're a white person. Hey, maybe even an advantage. And everything was more affordable. Yeah, wages were lower and people were able to buy homes. And now there's a lot of resentment that, hey, you guys had it easier and you did better than your parents. And generally, there's exceptions, but now you're leaving us in a worse position. You screwed it up. And some of that, I think it may be a little fair. Some of it, like, you hear, oh, you boomers, you did the 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act. I'm like, no, they were too young. That wasn't the boomers. But do you see that sort of resentment? And is there a grain of truth to that the boomers were happy to just inherit everything and they kind of trashed it and left nothing? They didn't really think long term for the country. You could argue the national debt was that way, like kick it down the road. I'll be dead by the time everything blows up. So what do I care? Sadly, some people do have that opinion.
Yeah, you know what? I at this event, it was a weird thing. When the first guy started talking, he said two things which I found really fascinating. One is he kept referring to the young men who are going to define the future of the country. And I looked around, I'm like, a lot of these guys are in their mid to late 30s. I wouldn't call them young men.
Right.
I mean, there were guys, half my age who got more gray hair than I have. So, and
I laugh because if I could interject, I heard that if a year or two ago, someone 24 talking about grown-ups, like he wasn't a grown-up and he was 24 years old. That's another issue is they had this long-term youth of still being like children. In fact, they invented this world called, I'm going to be a word, adulting. Have you heard that? I got to do adulting. I'm like, you're 35 years old. What are you talking about?
Hey, that the living at home business, man. People forget that was a big thing for the millennials. They staying at home, they come back from college, and they live at home for 4 or 5 years to save money. But it's a weird thing in a way, is that because it's the old expression, you don't know until you walk on a mile in another man's shoes or whatever it is that I remember seeing those stories and wondering about it because, look, I took a great deal of pride and always, really from a teenager on, I took care of myself. I've always had a job. I've always paid my own way. And, I was raised to think that was a good thing. Culturally, that was a good value for people our age and older. Independence and self-reliance were considered the sort of threshold for being a man. You couldn't, rely on other people. But that's a good, framework when it's completely possible. And I think millennials, you look at the economics that millennials face really is very difficult. The cost of education. It really is evil that we saddle college students with $100,000 in debt. I mean, that is evil. I mean, what the hell are we doing here? The baby boomers went to free colleges. People forget this. In the California university system, as long as you could test into it, was free. Most state colleges were not quite free. There was a nominal fee, but it was easy for a baby boomer, if they could get into college, to work their way through. They get a job.
Typically, you'd have a summer job and you can pay most of your tuition.
Yeah. And now our generation started getting tighter for sure, but it was still possible. I mean, you depended. I mean, you couldn't go to Yale and work your way through because of it, but a state college, you could do it. And but for millennials, that's never the case. I mean, I got curious about this because a lot of them mentioned that, and they also mentioned the price of homes, and of course, home prices, as these guys are coming online as adults. College tuition went up, so their debt went up, and then home prices go up. So all of a sudden, they're faced with this ridiculous mountain to climb, and they're not unreasonable in that. And that's one of the things that kept coming through in this weekend, is that they kept talking about how they were left. They feel, it seems as if these millennials see themselves as having been left a mess and left a country worse than their parents found it. And I don't think resentment is quite right, the word. It's just sort of this resignation, and that's a very different thing. Every generation in America has been optimistic. This is not an optimistic generation. I don't think Zoomers are optimistic. And, our generation was reasonably optimistic. I mean, look, man, how much fun was it to be teenagers in the 1980s? That was a good time, man.
I mean, our generation. Our generation was the one that rejected the boomers, 60s, social is like, no, we're about making money. Remember the 80s, greed is good, and Wall Street and all that. And it was a totally different vibe. So
our parties, we'd have parties, like kind of like the F. Scott Fitzgerald type parties, where everyone dressed up because we wanted to look like successful people. We wanted to be rich. We drank cocktails instead of cheap beer, that kind of junk. And I mean, it was just silly, teenage stuff. But you look forward to going out into the world. I mean, I got my driver's license the day I turned 16. I was ready to go out into the world and do stuff, and most people were. And these guys, it's the opposite. They came into a world, and they're not entirely wrong. I think they have every right to be pissed off about the pull yourself up by your bootstrap stuff. When you start looking at the numbers, they are getting bleeped. Now, when the boomers start dying off, the housing market's going to change rapidly. But, people don't, no one's really talked about that. But look, it's screwing them now. One of my boomer acquaintances, he brought this up a few months ago, that all of his friends are selling their McMansion, oftentimes to like Indian doctors, and buying small houses,
downsizing, kind of yeah.
But they're overpaying for it because they have all this equity. They don't care about the asking price. They're not, so they're driving the market up for all these young people trying to get into the market. So I mean, it really is, they are getting screwed. So I don't want to sound like somebody who's overly sympathetic to the millennials or the Zoomers, but I do see their point of view. I do understand to some degree where they're coming from, and I think that resentment and that resignation, I think it's a combination of those two things, is really going to make them a very different political animal. I see it with J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance reminds me of the kind of guy who comes in. You remember this in the business world? Things get screwed up, and they send this guy in. He doesn't take any shit. He just fixes the problem. He's not a dick. He's not a bad guy. He just knows what needs to be done. We're going to do these things, blah, blah, blah. And you either got on board or you went out the door. And Vance reminds me of that kind of guy. It's not that he's a genius or anything like that. He's going to say, here's how it's supposed to work, and it's going to work this way with or without you. And that's not, inspirational politics like we've been used to, dreaming big and all the other stuff. These guys are, they're going to be much more nuts and bolts, I think. Now, I mean, on the other side, you'll have Ocasio-Cortez in the sidecar as Vance is in the motorcycle driving down the road, and she's screaming about all the unfairness of the world. But so we'll have some entertainment at least.
Yeah. How do you see another divide is the approach to work? And again, this is a generalization, but I've seen a lot of these articles that Zoomers They find work to be toxic because they're expected to be on time and they're expected to do things sometimes they don't like. And I'm just really amazed at that. I'm like, yeah, that's called work. That's what are you?
We invented that word work for a reason. We would have called it fun if it was supposed to be fun.
This girl, I remember, boy, I wish I had the video, but she was all seriousness. She said, I was trying to get these jobs and these corporations, they don't take account for my disability of time unawareness, meaning I can't be on time is just part of my disability I have. And they need to make accommodations for me. So like, for example, if a report is due on Friday, oh, I have a disability. I may not get it done until a week later. It's just really crazy how they look at work that way. You saw this with the girl bosses, and they put out their videos where their work looks more like a spa, or they're just goofing around and doing PowerPoints. I think there may be a real alignment on that, and it's interesting because in my roundtable last night, people are saying, "Well, what's going to happen if these people refuse to work, or what are they going to do? Are they going to have to try to force them?" I'm like, well, back in the day, I don't want to sound like this guy, but I can remember my dad or grandparents' generation. It was never my grandpa's day like, oh, am I getting spiritually fulfilled with this job when you work on the railroad? It was like, no, I got to feed like myself and my family. It doesn't matter if I, get some enlightenment, but it is this weird sense of entitlement. And I don't want to sound like the old guy, but I am sure I am. That you see with a lot of the young generation that they think work is just because high school has become like a daycare. And I would say most universities are that way too. They're triggered about everything, safe spaces. Everyone gets an A for showing up. You see, I retweeted something. This one lady, girl, she graduated with honors from high school, and she's suing the high school because she doesn't know how to read, and she graduated with honors. So this is where we are right now. But they've had this. Yeah, she was black, but this is valedictorian, can't read her diploma. You go, girl. So there's been a little bit of this, let's just push everyone on. Everyone gets a trophy. That happened even later where you had these participation trophies. There's no winners or losers. I remember this was after me. I mean, we always played real competitive, but the generation after me when I was young, I was starting to raise my kids. They were like, hey, what we're going to do, we're going to have soccer matches, but we're not going to keep score because that's, bad for self-esteem. Of course, the kids kept score anyway. So it was a whole different view that went in. Whereas when I was young, my dad wasn't so much, but boy, some of those parents were psycho, really pushing their kids to, succeed. And so I think it's just sort of a different makeup on how they work at things. And they expect work to be that way too, to accommodate them. It should be something that they enjoy, and it can't be toxic. You can't talk mean to them because they have all these triggers, and they all have mental illnesses, right? Everyone in Generation Z, Millennial, they have mental illnesses that they brag about. In fact, sometimes they discuss their mental illnesses, and they're all in therapy, and they're very proud of it. It's a very different mindset in a lot of ways.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, for millennials, it's kind of an interesting thing in a way, is that on the one hand, they came into and lived, grew up in material prosperity that was never imagined. It's incredible how easy their generation had it. I mean, just look around. I mean, not like we grew up in, working in the mines when we were 7 years old or
right.
Like that. But it really took a huge leap all of a sudden. When you think about it, when I was 10 years old, we had a television with 3 channels.
Me too. Yeah.
And one maybe came in, didn't come in. That kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And you just didn't have the stuff. It just wasn't around that much. My father kept the cars running. He actually had to fix the cars. And then really quickly, the technological revolution takes off and the economy blows up with all this stuff. But in a way, the millennials, they rode along with all this luxury, and then they get into the adult world just as the bills are starting to come due.
Right.
And you can. That's why I say I can respect their resentment in a way. It's like, hey, wait a second, I could have lived without some Sega PlayStations or whatever the hell they're called. I could have had fewer channels. I could have, and it kind of feels like a bad deal. But it has, I think, had a big impact on their expectations. I mean, in the workplace, it's very weird sometimes dealing with younger people because, workarounds. In every system, I don't care if it's a computer system, a manufacturing system, it doesn't matter. There's always going to be stuff that's not accounted for. And somewhere along the line, people said, you know what? The cost of fixing this screw up is too high. We've got this workaround. Excel spreadsheets exist and are so popular because they're the great workaround. Oh, well, you don't put it into the system as it is. First, you put it into this Excel sheet, and then you put it in, the results. People have these workarounds. Millennials struggle with that mightily. I don't understand why the system doesn't do what it's supposed to do. And I'm like, well, because life isn't perfect. But you can't say that because that's just not an answer they'll accept. And it gets to that, on the one hand, having this sort of very comfortable life where things just seem to work. You push a button, you get the cookie. And then now they're in a world as adults, and you push the button, and the button gets stuck, and a whole bunch of cookies fall on the floor, and now you don't have any cookies. All of a sudden shit just goes wrong. And, of course, they have the economic issues and all that. So I think that fuels a little bit of the resentment. But the weird part about this, though, with the younger generations, is the inability to have the terror of confrontation. Think about how many times you've read people being laid off via email. What a monstrous thing. I mean, granted, it was a different age. I mean, getting laid off by the mail would have been probably kind of funny. Mailman comes by on a Saturday. Oh, by the way, you're fired. But still, I mean, I have had to sit down and tell people they're losing their job a lot of times in my life, especially when I was younger. It was just kind of like a rite of passage,
Yeah, I've had to do that too. Yeah, it's not fun, but you had to do that.
Yeah, and now they look for all kinds, and it's not just the hard stuff like firing; it's just corrections and all this. So that we'll create all these company metrics, so a manager doesn't actually have to go down and say to Sally, stop screwing up. Instead, the computer tells Sally to stop screwing up. There's all this very non-confrontational lifestyle. And a lot of that has to be probably being raised by women, and maybe the feminization of the workplace.
I think that is because I used to, when I was in the workforce when I was young, they said, oh, this guy, he's like a real bastard, hard ass boss. I loved him. He was kind of that way. He's the old school, but you always knew where you stand with him or where you stood. With women managers, you never knew. They're very passive aggressive, and it was just really frustrating. They use that soft language. You don't really know. And I think millennials and Zoomers really get into that. And because of the feminization of the workplace, you used to, I worked in environments, the bosses would just yell and swear at you, at our employees. And you didn't say, oh, I'm triggered. Oh, I need therapy. Oh, I'm going to the HR lady. And I don't think that is done anymore. So they do all these passive aggressive things. Like you talked about firing people via email or just pretending everything's okay until the very end. They're not really straight with people. They don't talk the truth. And I think that it's not fair to the people when you're that way. But I think we see that a lot because these people are so fragile. Like I brought up earlier, their trigger warnings. Again, when I first heard that, this is sort of a butt of a joke. I always thought this was tongue in cheek. But again, some people really do believe this. Like, college age students, I don't know if they read anymore. I doubt they read books, but they used to recently, like, oh, reading this book, there's trigger warnings here. There's sexual assault, non-consensual sex or whatever. So if they read War and Peace and violence, and I'm like, are you an adult? Are you little children? And it's this perpetual, again, it's feminization. They're just like little kids. They consider themselves kids long until they're in their 20s. And it's just a very strange way. And they have a hard time adapting to the real world.
Yeah, I think, it's funny. It has a lot to do, I think, with choices and comparisons. And I think to some degree, having each generation for a while, it seemed like, that the next generation was having it better, probably made it a little easier for you to kind of graduate into adulthood. I mean, I knew how hard my parents had things. I knew how tough, but I mean, I grew up poor, so it's a little different in a way. But I mean, even middle class guys I went to school with. So, they knew how hard their parents worked. I went to a prep school with a guy, his dad had been a mechanic like for the first 10 years of his life, finally saved up enough money to buy a shop, and it actually started being prosperous. And then he got a bigger house and all that, but dad still like saved old coffee cans, and
oh yeah,
that's
like it was that generation, and that's why I led the store. Like my grandparents, they ended up fairly prosperous, not rich, but boy, they were, because they had stories as a kid. They didn't always get dinner, so it just changed how they looked at everything in life.
Yeah, and so I think, but then all of a sudden now it's flipped around on its head. And if you're a younger person and you're coming into the world, into adulthood, and you're thinking, well, wait a second, I've had it really, really easy. I didn't have to work weekends or summers or after school or any of this stuff. I got all this great stuff. And now that's all over, the fun times are over. I'm going to have to go to this grind. And guess what? It's every step, it seems like it's getting worse. Oh, I'm done college. Now I've got this huge college debt. Oh, okay, I've got the college debt down. What? I got to have $50,000 down on a house, and it's a fixer-upper. After a while, you can kind of see how they start to maybe look at life as uphill instead of downhill, which I think a lot of prior generations kind of looked at and said, hey, you kind of got that little grade, but then you tick all the boxes, and it's going to be a nice run for you. So, I mean, I said I definitely sound a lot more sympathetic to them than people probably would expect. But I'm not, I'm very sympathetic to the boomers too. That's why I don't like boomer bashing. They're a product of the world they grew up in. I mean, how can you blame them for not trusting the system when the system worked really well as far as they're concerned? I mean, it worked fantastic. So,
yeah, 100%. And also with technology, mine was the first generation. When I went in college, there's an Apple computer my friend had. We started to work on, I played video games, one of the early people to do that, Pong, and so forth. But we were the early ones. But you see this in a change, and I think the technology, and there's that old expression, arguing with the boomers like arguing with your TV. And there's some truth to that they just, they watch Fox News. I know some older boomers, don't say their names, but they get all their information from Fox News or whatever. And whatever Fox News says, or Sean Hannity, he'll give you the straight up. That's all they know, because they don't really get much on the internet. I know that's not always the case. And obviously people watching here are boomers watching the internet. So that's, again, generalizations. Whereas young people, they grew up with 4chan, and that made a big difference for a lot of people. They grew up in these spaces that things weren't necessarily controlled as well as when we were young. So in some ways they've had more access to information than we were young, because, all the major networks were gatekept and controlled. And so I think that has really changed their point of views too. So the older generation, they were much more compliant with COVID, and they're more, let's rah the US, let's fight against damn Iran. And they still remember the hostage crisis of 1979 or whenever that was. And they still think of Russia as the Soviet Union. They're kind of stuck in that mode, which is understandable. That's a danger of getting old. You tend to get stuck in your past, because that's kind of defined you. So do you see that too? The technology really kind of, the generations are always different, but this technology has really changed things a lot, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah, it's something I've actually thought about a lot, because our generation's really kind of interesting in this regard. So one interesting thing about us, I think, is that we were coming online just as the computerization is coming on. One of my friends, when I was probably 8 or 10 years old, they had Pong, and which, I mean, it's kind of amazing that people thought this was a big deal. I mean, he and I would play with this, and the adults would just watch it. I mean, it was like they were riveted to it. The little square booped along,
Yeah.
And but he got one Christmas, there was this game that was a triangle, and it had like a pistol, it had a steering wheel, and I think Pong. I think that was like one, like a car game, and a shoot the dots on the screen game. And his father, who was a handy guy, he was a tradesman of some sort, and he's like, I don't know how this works. He starts looking at the instructions, and me and my buddy, we hook it up in like 2 seconds. We know how to do it. And one of them said, the nerds are going to take over the world. I'll never forget that because I didn't know what the word nerd meant. And so this was, the first time I ever heard the word, so it stuck with me. But for our generation, technology kept getting better and better. So I've always assumed that the tools that we use to work in our lives will get better. And if they're not, then we'll fiddle around with them and make them better. We just had that assumption. And the millennials, on the other hand, they come along expecting all the systems to work because they mostly did work. They seem like they worked, all this stuff. So they have a slightly different, they have a different expectation of the tools. Zoomers, on the other hand, are completely socialized by the tools. They can't live without the tools. I mean, they're one step away from living in those weird pods that the Japanese like for hotels. And they're just, the VR headset would probably be good for them. They sit there and they'll have food get shoved into them, and they live their lives in this virtual world because they're far more comfortable in that world than they are in the real world. At these thing over the weekend, there's a guy named Jay Burton who's he's interviewed a bunch of people. He's got a good YouTube channel. He's a very good interviewer, and he's a Zoomer, and he made that point. He said a lot of his friends struggle to socialize outside of the internet. They just, it's almost like it's an alien world. But it actually reminded me of something else, though, is that the Zoomers who are at this thing think it's hilarious that millennials still talk about themselves as being young. It's kind of the strange sort of, I found myself much easier to relate to the Zoomers sometimes when we start talking about this stuff, because they're looking at the millennials going, yeah, they're all going to be old guys. I can't wait to start calling them boomers. I mean, that's it's kind of funny in a way.
Yeah, it is. All right. Well, we'll get the questions now. You guys keep sending them in, and we'll get the ones we got in, but you have time to send more in, so please do. Pam, hi, $5. We'll do the rants first. What do you think Diane Biden's last words will be?
What's that thing he always says? Listen up, pal, or listen up, bud.
The thing is, yes. Yeah. Boy, that's that could almost be a show in itself. All how that's unrivaling, and now everyone's like, oh yeah, and seeing that. Well, we were deceived. We didn't know. How could have we known?
That probably would be a good show. I mean, because it really is just outlandish. I saw some clip from CNN where they're all putting on their astonished faces, like, you were part of this. I mean,
yes,
it really is remarkable in a way. What's that guy's name? Who has wrote a book and he's doing
Jake Tapper or whatever his
Tapper,
name.
yeah. I guess Megyn Kelly tore him a new one. Just he thought he was going to get a fluff interview, and she starts saying, look, you were part of the cover up. How come you have no shame? I mean, I started feeling bad for him because she's an animal sometimes,
Yeah, I start to feel bad, but then I think how they call this conspiracy theorists and all wackos and putting out fake news, fake narratives, and now they're admitting we're right. And I have a doctor friend. She medical doctor, not like Jill Biden. And she texted me after the diagnosis came out with Biden. And she said, there's no way that they just found out. They would have known this for a long time. They hid it from the American people.
Yeah, so, I agree with what you said. Just because he's now got a terminal disease, he's got a death sentence, doesn't make him less of an evil asshole.
No, because I mean, without being morbid, we all have a death sentence, right? It's just
exactly,
even if he didn't have this, he's 82 and he doesn't look well. He never. I mean, I didn't expect him to live very long anyway. So, but I think the plan is they wanted to get him in and then have Kamala, once he died or whatever, take over.
I thought they, honestly, my problem is, and I realized this, I thought about this. I had a 13-hour drive home, so I had a lot of time to think about stuff, And one of the things that occurred to me is that, I'm often too optimistic about people in the sense that I will see an idiot who has proven time and time to be an idiot, and I'll think, this time he can't be this stupid. And I'm always wrong, And I would have thought these morons would have snuffed out Biden after the first midterm, put a pillow over his face and then put Kamala in. That would have been a good play. They could have, and now maybe, of course, it turned out that she was actually worse than him, which is really, I mean, think about it. You're dumber than a guy with dementia. But I don't know. I mean, I'm just shocked that they have done, and they continue to do this. I mean, they're making it worse,
Yeah, and that these all revelations are coming out now that when they had meetings with Biden, he had staff meetings, he didn't know what was going on. He was confused. Well, you hear him interviewed, he can't answer a question. I said years ago, there's no way he could be on a show like this. He wouldn't be able
Oh
to
yeah.
process it. And I'm not saying that tongue in cheek. I mean that literally. He wouldn't be able to do it. So yeah, I don't know what his last words. I don't have much sympathy for him. I do have sympathy for Scott Adams. I feel bad for him because he has the same condition. But
I've had my problems with Scott Adams.
I have too. But
yeah, I mean, I think, you know what? I think Scott Adams, the thing about Scott Adams is I don't think he ever got up in the morning hoping that he could harm people. I think Joe
no,
Biden actually delighted in the suffering of other people.
yeah, I guess you could call Scott Adams the boomer at heart, right? So I forgot to use the generation terms. Ram, speaking of generational politics, your own mini fringe generation is called Generation Jones. You know, when I was researching this show, I do prep. I'd never heard that until I did the research. There is this phrase is called Generation Jones, which is people born between 1960 and 65, and people like Tom Cruise and Kamala Harris. And yeah, I mean, anytime you get on the edge of something, it doesn't necessarily apply. But I did see that because people that were in my era, again, we weren't raised by folk hippie music. I didn't go to Woodstock. I didn't go burn my draft card. I was a little kid at the time. That when I was came of age. We're talking Reagan. We're talking early MTV, Devo. We're talking, all the bands back then, the punk bands, and so
Metal bands and
metal bands
new
were coming out.
wave, synth wave,
New
all that kind
wave,
of junk. Yeah.
yeah. So that was my generation. It really, when I was growing up, when I was in college, anyone that like followed the Beatles, that was ancient history to me.
Yeah, right.
I didn't never listen to the Beatles when they were out still a band. I never did. I was a young kid. So I was a little bit different. And again, as I said, they tried this hippie protest when we were in school. And everyone was like, hell no, we're going to parties. What are you doing? And by the time I got to school, everyone started cutting their hair. Guys didn't have long hair so much anymore. And remember wearing like designer jeans and Izod's, very cringy, but it was like dressing up now, like you said.
Yeah, see, I went to boys' schools, Catholic schools, and we had, and it was like a couple of years before we came along. They got rid of the more you could wear jeans and sneakers and stuff like that. It was all back to dress pants, a jacket, a tie, everything else. So
yeah,
I dress like I dress like what was it, Alex P. Keaton. Remember him? What was it?
Oh yeah,
yeah. That's how I dressed every day going to school. I mean, because I had no choice; it was mandatory. So
yeah, and he's about my age, and he was exhibiting at the time how the generation had changed, where you went from the boomers who the cliche hippie generation. There was a movie called Valley Girl that kind of played off on that. I don't know if you saw that, but it was like her parents were like, oh my God, I'm so embarrassed. They're like these cringe. They didn't use the term cringe, but cringe old boomers that still think it's 1968. And she was into dressing nice and all that.
That show Family Ties with Michael J. Fox.
Yes.
The original premise was the stars and the people they thought the hook would be the parents, as the boomers complaining about their weird kids.
Right.
And it turned out the exact opposite, where he was the big star and the show really revolved around him. It was kind of like the same trick that they tried with Archie Bunker to try and make fun of poor people, and it turned out all the poor people liked working class people liked Archie.
Yeah. That I heard that. Yeah, he wasn't supposed to be the main character, but people really loved that character because he was like a young conservative, pro Reagan, and for people that didn't live during that era, it really turned things on the head because they always thought young people would be on the left and hippies and all that.
That's right.
And now someone on the right that's reading National Review. I know, but it was like, what the heck's going on here? This isn't the way it's supposed to be.
It was cool to be, it was hip to be square, being conservative was a cool thing. Yeah. It's amazing in a way. It's kind of embarrassing now. Luckily we didn't have leisure suits and perms or any of that kind of stuff. So the pictures of me when I was young don't look a lot. I mean, they're a younger version of the current me. So it's not embarrassing,
Well, you know, and I thought about that. That's another thing that young generations have to deal with, and thank God I didn't have to deal with it. We just had regular cameras, and meaning, you know, you had film, and so you go through your whole day, and you weren't being videotaped, and you
Yeah.
wouldn't be if you did. Because boy, I did some cringy, awkward things when I was in junior high, high school. I want to just think that now, kids today, that's out there forever. Goes, everyone sees it around the world potentially. That's gotta suck. It really does.
I'd probably be in jail. I mean, there's no way I could have lived that way.
I'm glad a lot of those things are in history. I just love to keep them there, you know. So, but yeah, young people have that issue. Okay, so that's some rants. Now we'll get into the. We got some power chats, so thank you on that. $20, Carl 9X. You guys are appreciated. We thank you for your generous donation. It makes this possible. Thank you. Songbird number 9, $20 too. Again, very generous. Thank you. Boy Scouts of America's provided wild time and U.S. culture heritage before the infiltration. Yeah, Boy Scouts. I remember my father, he was in the silent generation, but he was in the Boy Scouts in the years ago. In the early 50s or whatever, and that's when the Boy Scouts they actually taught you boy type of stuff.
Yeah, right. Yeah. They weren't sending the out in the woods with a strange man, you know.
Well, I mean, they were actually teaching you. I mean, they were shooting, archery, you know, how to build a fire, build stuff like that. Now, I guess it's about your pronouns and, you know, your sexuality and all that.
School still had shooting teams when we were little young people.
Yeah.
I mean, I got that's all gone now, I'm sure, you know.
Yeah, my grandfather, he used to come home from elementary school with his rifle and they would shoot for squirrels. It could be dinner. John Richardson, hens without roosters don't settle down to roost. Hens without roosters don't settle down to roost.
Yeah, well, you know, women, you know, they need a man in their life. You know, there's there's a lot of underground sort of research on this that, you know, that females really should get married, should begin mating, you know, late teens, early 20s. And there's hormonal changes that come with having a male and reproducing that carries into their middle and later years. You know, these women who are not having children are possibly going to be even more insane in their 40s and 50s than they have been in their 20s and 30s, which really doesn't bode well given the number of single women around. You know, I mean, it is what it is. It's, you know, I'm doing my part, but, you know.
Well, you know, I know they've done a lot of polls that married women are happier than single women. That is, it's a fact. I know married women complain a lot and all that, but women that aren't married, they tend to get kind of odd in the head, and they get they adopt various weird causes instead of like looking for their own children. They are advocating for poor refugees or something, or trans kids, or they get into weird things, and being married tends to calm them down a little bit.
Years ago, I think it was back in the Bush years, Steve Saylor charted the percentage of white women who were married and looked at, you know, by state, and the higher percentage of white women who were married, the more Republican the state. And it was crazy how it correlated so perfectly. I mean, if the white women are getting married and having kids, the state will be right wing. If they're not, then it'll be Massachusetts.
Well, you know, I have a lady that I've met at American Renaissance. I've known for years. Sweet lady. She's married. She goes by Courtney from Alabama. I don't know if you met her, but she was in the AmRem this year. But and we go way back since 2013. I think when I first met her, first spoke there. She was single at the time. Now she's married, but she did a lot of research, and she's published a lot on articles about married white women, you know, because she really hates this in our sphere, a certain group, you know, that, you know, the real problem are women. And she said it is actually, if you look at women that are married, white women that are married, they vote pretty much Republican like their husbands. That's not, it's the white single women that are batshit insane. White single men are okay. Married men are okay, but are white. But white married women, they're not really insane in their politics. It's the single women.
Well, and it's funny about you brought this up. The other day, I got a bunch of dead trees I got to clear out, right? So I'm in there mucking around, and I have I don't wear shorts, so I walked into I didn't see it as a sticker vine thing,
Mm-hmm.
and of course it wrapped around my leg, and I started laughing because I thought about how you always joke about the trad woman in the field and all that.
Yeah, barefoot running through. Yeah.
Yeah, if anybody saw me, they think, "What the hell's wrong with that guy? He's laughing like a simpleton with his legs hanging around." I just couldn't help but laugh, because I just had this image in my head. She's running free, and all of a sudden she got chiggers all over her. A vine wrapped around her leg.
Yeah, that's always a weird meme. It's almost like LARPing where they try to do it. I'm like, you're just telling me you've never really lived in the country, because I have my boots on, I have my jeans on when I work in the yard here, and I still get ticks on me, and I hate it. Always pulling them off, and you do not want to frolic around half naked in the woods around here, even though it looks like real trad or free or whatever. It's no, you don't want to do that. Jay Reaction, thank you, $5 super chat. I think younger people, Generation Alpha, are more right wing. Makes sense since leftism is the status quo and being young is rebelling against it. Yeah, there's a real division too, and then you start to get into problems because the younger generations, we're kind of in this whole discussion, at least mentally, I'm thinking of white people, right?
Right,
But then
right, yeah.
it gets a little bit different when you're talking because the whites aren't the majority of young people, and
Right.
so a lot of when you're talking about the black population, I've always said trying to define it in right wing, left wing terms doesn't really make a lot of sense. No offense, a lot of blacks I've known, they really don't have deep ideological thinking about how they go around. I mean, they may vote Democrat, but it's not like they're watching The Amazing Atheist or they're reading Karl Marx or they have this labor theory of money. It's not that, right? So it kind of breaks down when I don't know how you call that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure there's a spectrum there somewhere, but my hunches and my almost overwhelming desire to say that it's the hate whitey spectrum. The left wing really hates whitey, and the right wing kind of okay with whitey.
Well, there's a lot of people that, and this is true of whites, but I think it's especially true of Hispanics and blacks, that they're not really so much political animals, but they act in certain ways. Like I've always said that, like when you see the riots and they're looting shoe stores and they're jumping around happy and twerking, and then the media saying, "Oh, well, the anger over the police brutality." Meanwhile, they're laughing, jumping down. I'm like, they don't give a shit, right? They don't give a shit about George Floyd. Hell, they would have popped him off and be happy with it. It's just this is an excuse to do their thing. And so I think you got to be careful in putting political ideology reasons for all this type of behavior. So
I think the Generation Alpha, because they are going to be a minority. They look. One of the things. Who was I? I was talking. This was last night. I was talking about this. I said this to Peter Brimelow. I said, if you want to make Vermont into a red state, send a portion of Baltimore's population to Burlington, Vermont. All of a sudden, that in their face will change all their attitudes. Because you look how the white voting habits in the South and the black belt.
Yeah, Alabama, Mississippi, whites vote 80-90% Republican because they've been around it.
Yeah, so I think white kids who are teenagers now are probably going to make David Duke look like a softie when it comes to race relations, because it's not just black and white for them. They've got Hmong people, they've got they got all these weirdos from all over the damn world in their schools. So they're going to have even an extra. They have lots of things to hate,
Yeah, and I think they have a less tolerance too on both sides of the special people. That's just. I think there's an issue there too.
Well, I think we both can say we find that very disappointing, and we hope that the president will address it.
You guys need to go and look at the empty shoes to feel bad about them. All right, K-Max, thank you, $10, very generous, K-Max, thank you. Does the media only pit white people by generation against each other? I never see other races divided as much by generation. Do they have less generational variance? Yeah, I don't like generational warfare because we're all in this together. And even though we have differences, I'm harsh on boomers too that don't give a damn about younger people, even though they're going to be dead. I That's what I said, for example. Tariffs in my situation are bad for me personally because I'm retired and it's better for me to get slave labor from China because everything's cheaper for me. But I'm okay with tariffs because I know that helps create job growth and helps my country even after I'm gone because I have kids and stuff. So I think older people, if you're ethical or I don't know what to say, you still care about the future and but I don't understand the mindset. Well, I don't give a damn. I'm going to be dead. So to hell with them all. I don't understand that mindset. Um, but at the same time, it's not like the boomers put all this in. I mean, most people don't have any control of what the politicians do. Boomers didn't have anything to do with the 1965 Immigration Act. Most of boomers are just trying to live like everyone else. So I don't think the generational war stuff is good. And I do think it is used mostly against white people. However, I started the show just curious. And at least in Asia, they do have some generational things back and forth just because like someone that was raised under Mao is very different, an old person now, a Chinese person than a new young Chinese. So there are generational differences in other countries too.
Well, they found in the where the pyramids, there's this place where all the workers they've actually, it turned out these worker encampments turned out to be far more interesting because a lot of the graffiti, kind of gives you a sense of what people were really like on a daily basis. And a lot of it, the graffiti of these workers, people who are working on the pyramids, is complaining about the youth of Egypt, that they don't work hard, they don't respect their elders. I mean, so you're talking about 5,000 or 4,000 years ago. It is a universal thing, and I think look, I think it's because. John Derbyshire once talked about this. He said, the older you get, the more concerned, in a way, you think that you haven't done enough to make things good for the next generation. So that's what motivates this kind of desire to, want them to do better. Want the younger people to do better. And concern. I mean, because you look at the voting patterns of old people. I mean, Trump does really, really well with old white guys. Boomer white guys. I mean, female boomers are a little less supportive, but they look and they're they're right there. They hung with him when his tariff business caused the stock market to quaver a little bit. They look and say, hey, we can't leave the place in shambles. So right. I don't I mean, I think some boomers do come off as selfish and stuff like that, but I mean, but everybody does. I mean, there's idiot Zoomers. I mean, I can think of a couple of Zoomers that are irritating as all hell. So, I mean, it gets back to where we started, though. The generalizations are useful in a certain area, but, you can't overdo it. You can't go too crazy with it.
All right, let's look at some power chats now. And again, you guys still have time. We'll keep answering them as they come in. Robert, the baby boomer difference on Israel is apparent. Near 100% support among boomers, less so among younger generation. How much did the internet play this role? Imagine how TV news presented Israel versus the internet. Robert, this is an excellent question. And I'll throw it to you, Z-Man. How much did the internet, both on the left and the right, cause Israel to lose a lot of support for the young people?
Yeah, I don't know. And the reason is, this goes back to what this whole business say with South Africa. What the best, if I was advising the crazies, I would say, shut up about this. You don't bring attention to this. There's only one right answer, and you're trying to be against that. So shut up. And the whole Joe Biden business, they should have just. I mean, and I think the Israel business in the last year and a half or so, the pro-Israel lobby has so outlandishly overplayed their hand. And I think in a lot of ways, because they ham-fistedly tried to gaslight people online, younger people who are, I think, far more in tune to being gaslit. They understand the bullshit because they do it all the time. They use the internet. They exaggerate.
Right.
So I think there's some of that there, but I also think it's just general incompetence. I mean, the people who are making these decisions you can't blow up schools and hospitals and try and get sympathy for people. I'm sorry, even the most, Ben Shapiro thinks that's a good idea, but I mean, I think just even people who have been indoctrinated to be pro-Israel pull back from that. I mean, you're talking about 10,000 children have died in these bombings. I mean, that's just monstrous.
Yeah, and I think the whole Holocaust card is wearing thin for younger people because it was so long ago. Whereas you remember, we talk about Joe Biden, he was alive when that event happened, right? Whereas these other people, this was like, it might as well be the Revolutionary War or something. And what happened, was it 75 years ago now or something, is irrelevant to these people. That doesn't give you a pass to, just because your granddaddy miraculously survived the Holocaust gives you the right to, engage.
Yeah. Hey, we're almost out of Nazis. 80 years. You think about it. Your actual genuine Nazi is in his mid-90s. I mean, how many of those guys could be left?
Yeah, no, I know. There's almost none now. I mean, the World War II generation is almost gone. And by the way, a lot of those guys, my grandfather, he was of the age during that time. I mean, they were really good men there too. They had their own issues, but it's kind of sad to see them go. Tony, thank you, Tony. To a boomer, is the belief that Africa could thrive under capitalism and any white country thrives only based on the government system? The truth is the people matter more than the system. Is this a boomer thing more than the younger generations? I think there's a change now with a lot of people, especially on what you say, the right, and I use like Matt Walsh as an example. I think a lot of people are seeing through this. But yeah, a lot of the boomers were very civic nationalists because that's what they were taught. And I've known many people in real life that, they were sympathetic to like the civil rights movement when they were young until they actually had to live around the populace and their views changed. So what do you think? Is this a generational thing? I guess the whole race question.
Yeah, I mean, I think look, when we were young guys, you could live your life without actually seeing, other than on television, Black people. And we're really only talking about Black people. You didn't have the overwhelming number of Hispanics.
No, this was basically a two-race, except for the Southwest, you had some Hispanics, but otherwise it's basically a two-race country here.
Yeah, now, if you're a 30-year-old, you can't escape it. It's everywhere all the time, and it always has been. So I think, look, familiarity breeds contempt. I mean, it's easy to feel sorry for Black people when they're only on your television, right? But when they're breaking into your garage, you don't have the same sympathies for them.
Right. And that's what we talked about earlier, how you could get Vermont red. Yeah. There is a lot of truth to that. Joseph, baby boomers grew up in a 90% white America. That's true. And actually, a lot of them is 100% because most of the Black population was either in the South or in certain areas. Whereas Gen Z is barely 55% one. How much is this the disconnect? Boomers have no idea what the white minority is like. I've talked about this. I do think this is a factor. Again, if you always were raised white around other white people, and then you read like Kill a Mockingbird and you watched your boomer TV in the 70s and 80s, you saw Roots and you saw all how the Blacks are being prejudiced. People are prejudiced against them. They didn't use the term racist so much as bigot and prejudiced, and we just need to be nicer to them. I think that really influenced a lot of their thinking. Whereas when you live in the environment, you just see, let me just say, it's a little bit more nuanced than when you actually live in the environment.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, my business partner, who's in his mid-70s, he told me many, many times that the first Black person he ever actually genuinely interacted with was when he was in college. He had gone to that point without ever actually having a conversation with a Black person. And it wasn't because he was, grew up in the Klan or something. It's just, that's just the way America was. Yeah. And, unless you lived in the South, you had no exposure to Black people.
Right. Yeah, that was definitely true. And the only exposure I had when I was a kid is when I visited my grandparents. They lived in Chicago, and they were very aware of racial realities, especially South Chicago. Even back then, you didn't want to go in South Chicago because that community was plagued by violence. Violence just picks on them for some reason. It's like this outside force comes down on them. Randall Flagg, this is another rant. Thank you. Speaking of generational politics, your own mini fringe generation. Oh no, I got that before. So yeah, that's the Jones generation. Let me just refresh because I always hate when I miss them. So I'll just do a real quick refresh on my Powerchats. And let me just look at the Streamelements and make sure I got everything because I always hate to miss it. Oh, here we go. I'm glad I looked. And this is Songbird 9. Would you and Z-Man consider do a rap song together? Very easy with AI technology. Rap about white people. Let's see here.
No, that will never happen.
No, I don't think we would do the rap songs together. So
it's already been done. Saturday Night Live did this in like the 1980s. They had the white guy rap, and it was two like accountants who did a rap song, and it wasn't funny. And that was the last white people to ever try to do a funny rap song.
Yeah,
word went out. We know, we get the memo.
Yeah, it did. I did one though. When I first did my videos, there's this lady named Patricia McAllister. I don't know why I remember that. And she was all bitching about white people and all this. And then all of a sudden she talked about another special group. And she got canceled even though she's a black female.
Yeah, almost all music I find enjoyable except that form of music. To me, as I've said it many times, it sounds like somebody is just throwing pots and pans down a stairwell. It hurts my ears to listen to.
Well, it's just pure rhythm. There's no melody or harmony. It reminded me of when I was a little kid. I don't know if when I was like first grade, the girls would sing rhymes when they did. Yeah. And it just sounds like rhyming as little kids. So yeah,
when I hear hip hop music, very dark thoughts start creeping into my mind. So
yeah, I do not like it either. That's a type of music I'm not a big fan of. But hey, because it's good. So, hey guys, thank you so much. This was a really fun show. We got a lot of good interaction. And let me see here. Yeah, we have 1,100 on, so excellent, and it's great to see everyone. So Z-Man, thank you. Thank you for suggesting this. You had a good suggestion. And guys, we're always open for suggestions next week. Either let Z-Man know or myself, and we'll kick it back and forth. We can always be bribed too. So with a donation.
Well, next week, since it's kind of a slow week with Memorial Day and all that stuff, we could do a victory lap on COVID. Did they let you talk about COVID on YouTube anymore or now?
I don't know. I'll research that. We could still do it on X and Rumble. I could check on that though, because I think I told you of all my history since 2008 on YouTube, the only real trouble I got in big time was with COVID. They just shut down any discussion on COVID unless it was very approved. That was just the craziest time ever. Everyone wants to forget that too, that like it never happened.
I got an email the other day, the end of last week, an apology from a reader, and they said, you probably don't remember, I said all these terrible things about you, and I've been so ashamed, but I finally had to get over it and apologize. And I'm like, I sent it back like, that's good enough.
Yeah, I got a couple too. There's a couple of people that say, yeah, Ramsey, Paul, you were right. We're sorry. Because at the time, I know you were on the same wavelength as me. I felt very alone there for a while, and everyone said how it was like I wanted to kill everyone's grandma, and I didn't like science, and honestly, it doesn't even seem like a real time. You had all these Karen type women, middle-aged women running around you got to get your mask up, social distancing. They were arresting people just sitting on the beach alone. You remember that? It's just crazy.
Oh yeah, this will be a great show next week.
Yeah, let's do that.
We could do hours on that.
Yeah, and I remember they had this playground, and I just moved here to Arkansas, and they had it all like police taped. You know, like there's been a crime, mass murder there. I'm like, what the hell? It was just insane. It was insane.
I had to get a certificate to go into the office. I had to get I got this certificate that I was an essential person to go into the office, only to find out that the landlord wasn't an essential person, and the doors were locked. I couldn't get in, so we had to all stay home.
Yeah, Sasha and I sometimes were the only people without a mask on. We went to Boulder, Colorado. Oh boy, did that trigger them! Oh, what are you doing? It really did. Honestly, it really disillusioned me with people. It really did.
And you know what? I can say I try to be an optimistic guy, but my cynicism was at 11. I'm thinking, you know what? We deserve this to be a super bug. You know, an extinction event. You know.
You know, and I was thinking, okay, I moved down here in the South. People be strong, stand up against this bullshit. No. It was embarrassing. Yeah, that was it. And yeah, we've just seen a lot of the aftermath of that. Weird times. Well, part of the censorship, we could talk about this next week, came from the government. They wrote YouTube and saying, we want you to censor people. And Twitter at the time, they wrote too. Horrible violation of the First Amendment. Like they don't care, but
it's just like Joe Biden's dementia. All this stuff is trickling out. I mean, you know, these hearings and all this stuff. Kennedy is dumping all this stuff out, and it's like, and the media is not. They're like, oh well, you know, who knew? Well, you did.
Yeah, exactly. I know we could have told you, but we were censored, right? So yeah, I got 2 strikes on YouTube because of, and I was saying wild stuff, but it was just.
Oh yeah, I mean, a lot of people got just, you know, they got nuked and that was it. They're gone. I mean, you know, and I mean, just basic, just common sense questions, you know.
Yeah, it was. Well, they had that. Remember, they had those 2 doctors from San Diego, and they had doctors actually worked in the field. Like, well, guys, it's not necessarily what you're saying it is. No, we're not going to tolerate this. So I just picture some purple-haired. Trust and safety person at YouTube, you know, probably with pronouns, determining what people can hear on health over doctors.
Or worse yet, some guy in India who does, you know, has to crap outside. He's the guy making these decisions. That's unhealthy. Okay. Yeah.
But it was a time that a lot of middle-aged women that didn't have anything better to do really thought they were main characters in a superhero movie and they were saving everyone. And then you had these evil villains that were keeping the virus alive because we just wouldn't follow instructions. Remember that? It's like, remember Biden? It's hard for me to get really sympathetic with Biden when he said, if you don't get the vaxxers, you're facing a long, cold winter of death. And frankly,
I forgot about that.
We're losing our patience. Remember, he had that red background, and he wanted to make it illegal if you went to a big company to work unless you had the vax until the Supreme Court slapped him down, which ended COVID because then the South wasn't forcing the vaccines. Oh man, I'll never forgive Biden for that. So as I said before, I don't wish cancer on anyone, but I do feel sorry for Scott Adams, even though I disagree with him somewhat. I don't feel sorry for Joe. I'm not going to.
Honestly, when it comes to Joe Biden, I feel sorry for the cancer.
Yeah, I'd have to live with that. Yeah. All right. Well, we'll tentatively think about that. I think we could do it, you know, but guys, make sure you get your vaccines. Oh, now they're telling people not even get them if you're under a certain age. So it's kind of funny how they're backing off on that. All right, guys, wear your mask. Talk to you guys later. Thank you, Z-Man. Bye-bye.